Brazil's Flight 2283 has become the world's latest, most devastating aviation disaster. This deadly crash, captured in stark, terrifying detail on civilian phones, went viral on social media. Seemingly out of nowhere, it fell from the sky, heading straight for a busy housing district. Then, in a plume of smoke and destruction, 62 lives and a loyal family dog met their gruesome end in front of the entire world. But there's more to this horrifying crash than meets the eye. Because Flight 2283 isn't the first of its kind. And if we don't do something about this particular set of circumstances soon, it's only a matter of time before it happens again. Here's what we know so far. And the scary reality that awaits the world of aviation if we don't do anything about it. Plane, pilots, and passengers. We start where we always do, with the history of the plane in question and what we do know of the pilots and passengers. Danilo Santos Romano, just 35 years old, he logged 5,202 flight hours with no previous record of any major problems in his decade behind the controls. Romano had just completed his first year as commander for Voepass airline, where he was employed for a total of 2 years. And he was looking forward to starting a family with his wife, Talita, one day so that he could take his kids to watch soccer with him at the stadium, one of his favorite pastimes. Co-pilot Humberto de Campos Alencar y Silva was 61 years old, but the rest of his information is still a little hazy. It doesn't look like Silva was ever under any suspicion of wrongdoing, so the lack of information on him is most likely due to the enormity of the event and that his life and history in the cockpit just got overshadowed by everything else that's been going on. The ATR 72-500 in question's records are sealed for the time being, but it doesn't seem like the machine had any major issues in its decades of flying all over the world. And since there were no other problems with the aircraft at Voepass Airline, it can only be assumed that its maintenance schedule was in order. The flight was set to depart from Cascavel, Paraná to Sao Paulo for a domestic daytime flight. And honestly, the 2.5-hour flight within Brazil's own borders was supposed to be a boring one. Practically like a day off for pilots who are used to making long international flights that require multiple pilots to relieve each other throughout the flight to avoid exhaustion. Everyone expected the next 2.5 hours to be a breeze. Earlier that day, all flights in the Sao Paulo area were warned of ice at stormy conditions. But the forecast showed that it would be within safe parameters for flights, so pilots were just told to be vigilant. 2283 wasn't too worried about this though. The ATR 72 had received an upgrade a year or two before, just for this kind of thing. The rubber tubing it was fitted with is also called rubber boots, and they are a deterrent for the icy buildup that occurs at those high elevations. We'll get into the specifics of this weather occurrence and the rubber boots in just a minute. For now, back to the scheduled flight. 58 passengers, 2 stewardesses, and the 2 pilots were all seated for their departure at around 11 o'clock on the morning of August the 9th. There was a 20-minute delay to get them in the air, but this was not due to any technical difficulties. There was some confusion among the passengers as to which gate they were supposed to be at, and as a result, 10 passengers missed this deadly flight completely. At the time, they were undoubtedly annoyed and frustrated, feelings that were quickly replaced by a shock and relief so overwhelming that many of them would begin their own tormentous journey of survivor's guilt just an hour and a half later. Among the passengers were a father and his 3-year-old daughter, on their way to celebrate Brazilian Father's Day together. Liz Iba dos Santos was the only child on the flight that day. There were a large number of doctors on board, all headed to a seminar on the latest cancer research. Some of the oncologists were considered leaders in their respective fields and the go-to experts for cancer patients in Brazil. Then there was Josgladys Gonzalez, along with her son and mother, who took a later flight so that they could vaccinate their beloved family dog, Luna. They couldn't bear leaving the canine behind, so Luna, with all of her paperwork in order, was given a sedative and loaded in her crate alongside the luggage at the rear end of the plane. Flight 2283 falls from the sky. The first hour and a half went exactly as everyone expected it to. And from what we can tell, from the black box and cockpit recordings, nothing was out of place for more than half of the flight. Above the state of Venedo, just 76 miles from their destination, records show that the plane dipped down a little at 1321. But the pilot corrected this and steered them back up to 17,000 feet. So far, that's nothing to get alarmed about. 1 minute later, Romano asks E. Silva, "What's going on?" E. Silva replies that the plane needs more thrust. Before E. Silva can even finish that sentence, the plane plummets, and the flat spin begins to take full effect. The intense centrifugal force would have been so extreme that every passenger was thrown into the walls and their seats, unable to move an inch from the force slamming into them. Jos Gladys manages to throw her arms around her son, and little Liz grabs her daddy's arm. On the ground in the busy streets of the Capea neighborhood, several people look up, confused. Like a child's toy thrown from the balcony, the aeroplane, falling from the sky, twirled and circled to the ground. Those who managed to grasp the severity of the situation immediately started filming. The ones in the vicinity of where the aeroplane was heading toward ran for cover, and the last sounds we hear from the cockpit are the passengers' screams, one of the pilots gasping, and the final deafening sounds of metal meeting the ground, 24,064 feet per minute. The footage shows plumes of black smoke darkening the sky. People in the neighborhood ran to the scene, but there was nothing anyone could do. The flames and the smoke was so thick that no one could get close enough anyway. They were forced to wait for firefighters to arrive. Every single one of the 62 individuals on board were dead on impact, and by some miracle, no one on the ground was injured. 2283 met its end in the front yard of a house inside of a gated community. If any silver lining can be taken from this terrible tragedy, it's that an entire passenger plane crashed into a busy residential area, and not a single person in the surrounding neighborhood had so much as a scratch. Statistically speaking, the impossible happened that day. And then before Brazil could even comprehend the enormity of what had happened, authorities swarmed onto the scene, covering the ground in a thick layer of white foam to put out the flames. First to be identified was Romano, then E. Silva, both by their uniforms. Jos Gladys was later found with her arms still around her son. Luna was thrown from her crate, and her body was remarkably still relatively intact, until one by one, every person on Flight 2283 was identified, buried, and mourned by the entire nation. So what on earth happened? Everyone wants to know. But until the investigation is complete, we can only make some educated guesses. So let's get into the theories. Ice buildup, aviation's deadliest foe. Now is a good time to get to those ice conditions that we mentioned earlier. Until the official report comes out, we can't say for sure whether or not these conditions are to blame. But the forecast that day makes this the most likely possibility that 2283 came down so suddenly. You see, even in a place that's as warm and sunny as Brazil, in the middle of the day, no less, has very different conditions several thousand feet up in the air. The higher that average moisture present in tropical climates, coupled with the colder temperatures that high up, makes for the perfect set of circumstances to create ice buildup. It's not quite cold enough to form snow or hail. But when the minuscule droplets come into contact with an airborne body, for instance, a metallic airplane, the droplets freeze on the body, creating a film of ice. And that ice buildup can thicken fast, weighing the plane down with a dangerous amount of weight in just 5 minutes. Seriously, the ice buildup gets thicker and thicker by the second. In less than 5 minutes, you're talking about a few tons of ice that's formed across the body. This particular model of ATR has a bad track record with ice in the air. They're already heavier than the average passenger plane. And there have been several disastrous crashes specifically because of ice buildup. The ice doesn't just weigh the aircraft down. It freezes over the sensors outside that measure altitude, speed, and all sorts of navigational information that the pilots need to steer the aeroplane. In our last video on Air France's Flight 447, this was exactly what happened. The pilot's elevation information became scrambled because of the iced-over sensors, and they kept going higher and higher because the computer told them that they were losing height, when in fact they were never under their intended height at all. And as we know, this led them to go higher and higher until they stalled in midair, and then they went into a full-on free fall straight into the ocean. Go check out that video if you want the full breakdown of tropical ice buildup. We'll link that for you in the description. If the ice gets thick enough, it can cause drag, slowing the aircraft down. This causes turbulence. Now, turbulence isn't usually a problem. Most passenger aircraft have autopilot systems in place to counteract this and prevent the yoke from being ripped out of the pilot's hands while they're steering. The ATR is not as resilient on this wide steering coverage from the computing power though. A lot of the steering is completely up to the individual to handle. So just like your car, if the plane dips or shakes, the steering will move with the rest of the plane, and it's up to the driver to keep the steering wheel in place. Flight 2283 was looking at similar ice conditions up ahead, but because of the rubber tubing that this ATR had, they were deemed prepared to deal with it. The rubber tubing expands and retracts at intervals when sleet buildup occurs, essentially breaking the ice away from the wings. When the ice is broken up and sent flying away, they bounce over the rest of the plane's body, cracking up the rest of the ice that boots can't break up. Can you see the gaping problem here? The boots ensure that the wings are clear of ice, sure, but the rest of the plane is reliant on the off chance that a big enough shard lands just right to shatter the buildup on the rest of the body too. If the conditions are just right, only parts of the wings will be cleared up, leaving the rest to build up ice without interference. To complicate matters, in the event of severe icing, pilots can implement several maneuvers to get rid of the buildup, like increasing speed or going into a slight dive to build up more speed, so that the propellers can move faster to dislodge the buildup. But if there's ice on that body, that means that there's ice on the sensors too. If the sensors can't tell the pilots what's happening outside, then they won't know to accelerate or reduce their elevation to combat the ice sufficiently. By the time the buildup gets heavy enough, well, it's too late to do anything to stop them from plummeting from the sky. In almost all of the previous crashes, due to severe icing, the records show the same thing. One moment all is seemingly well, and the next, everything goes to hell. In the blink of an eye, everything on the dashboard reads perfectly, and the next, the plane stalls to a standstill in the air and suddenly falls out of the sky like a rocket. And there's no stopping the momentum until you reach the ground in one final deadly end. Small aircraft can be brought back from the flat spin that happens after a dead stall, but passenger aircraft are just too heavy to do this. That's not to say that it hasn't been done before, but it's nearly impossible, especially for a bulky craft like the ATR. Everything about the weather conditions that day indicate that the ice buildup caused Flight 2283 to experience one or a combination of these scenarios. The body iced over, making the aeroplane heavier than it should have been. The drag combined with the struggling engines caused them to lose speed, and with every sensor outside of the craft also iced over, the pilots had no idea that anything was wrong until the plane came to an almost complete stop midair. They stalled and dropped down so hard that the pilots, no matter how hard they pulled on the yoke, couldn't humanely apply the force needed to tilt the nose up or down. There was no autopilot sufficient enough to help them. Not that it would have mattered anyway. With all that ice over the sensors, the computers weren't aware of the extreme buildup until it was too late. By the time the sensors were melted clean and sending accurate readings to the cockpit again, they would have been less than 20 seconds from crashing to the ground. When Romano asked what was going on, that was most likely the moment that they began to spin and fall. The response from E. Silva makes sense then. The only way they could stop the momentum would have been to thrust forward, but the centrifugal force that was pinning the passengers to their seats was also pushing the yoke. That's why the cockpit goes so silent. Romano and E. Silva were probably both pushing all of their focus and strength against their yokes to get the craft to go forward in an attempt to stabilize. Or they realized that they were being dragged into a crawl, also justifying a forward burst of speed. Whether the sensors went haywire or the body got too heavy with ice, The black box information that we've got so far doesn't look like the sensors were sending them the wrong elevation information, like what happened with Air France's flight. There were some reports that leaked that the ice buildup at the back end of the plane, but this can't be verified yet. That wouldn't be surprising though. The tail would be more vulnerable to buildup, and extra weight that was concentrated there could explain why the plane would spin if a gust of wind hit it at just the right angle. But who knows? One thing is certain. For a plane to suddenly fall from the sky, it would need to come to a dead stall in the air. And there aren't a lot of circumstances that can cause that to happen, besides ice weighing the plane down and causing the engines to become less efficient. Regardless of what our theories are at this stage, ice buildup almost certainly had something to do with it. And the history of the ATRs and ice is a terrifying one to look into. In 1994, an American ATR rolled in the sky before crashing and killing all 68 people on board. Then there are 2 reports of ATRs going down in Russia since the 90s, one killing 33 of the 43 passengers on board shortly after taking off, and another from France. All in all, there are 470 confirmed deaths as a direct result of ice buildup on the ATR model. Specifically, most of them were fitted with rubber boots. But there are many more crashes where this set of conditions was suspected, but could never be proven. So the true number is probably much, much higher. And the fact of the matter is, those boots are not enough to combat the weather conditions alone. Yes, some ATRs are equipped with better circulatory internal heating mechanisms, but there aren't nearly as many installed as there should be. Like we said in the beginning, Flight 2283 wasn't the first, and it certainly wasn't the last of its kind. And almost every single time icing causes decrease in drag, excess weight, and sensor malfunctions to occur together, the severity of the situation is realized too late, and there's nothing a pilot can do, no matter how good they are at their job. While Brazil mourns the biggest loss of their life they've experienced in a single moment in decades, the investigation goes on in the background. And the question on everyone's minds is, what are we going to do about what is clearly a very serious problem that's been quietly racking up the death toll in the background for years now? And what is the true number really? Or maybe the death toll is so high that we might not be able to handle the truth.